How are you guys feeling about like salaries in the market? How are you feeling? Like, are those lining up with, from like a couple years ago? And of course, nothing will really line up to 2022. Those were the gravy train
Yeah.
days. But how are you feeling about salaries these days?
Yeah, I think there is a bias in terms of some of the things that I work on, in terms of I'm there and I'm working with that company because they need top tier. And that means that much more of a search needs to be done. It's not as simple as just popping a post on LinkedIn and expecting to hire people off the back of that. They need some of the best. And it just goes without saying almost that if you want the best of the best, you've got to pay the best of the best, or you've got to at least be on par. Otherwise, you can't get there. So there is a slight bias with many of the things I work on, in that if the salary doesn't align to their expectations, I can be very upfront with them from the get-go and just say, this goal will not be achieved with your budget.
Yeah.
I really want a Ferrari, but if I've got the budget for a Kia, it's just not going to happen. It doesn't matter if I walk into the dealership with that stack of cash. They're just going to say, no, it's not going to work. So I think that salaries are still in a good spot, but the expectations are high. If you want a top tier salary, you've got to be a top tier person too, for that company, for that alignment. Yeah. So I still think they're pretty solid. I'll challenge designers on their salary expectations if I don't think that they line up. I will happily share with the designer that I don't see how that's going to happen. I don't see how they're going to get in the room based on that number. And I don't want them to not get in a room because of a number. I want them to get into rooms because of their experience. At the same time, I can think of a couple of conversations I've had with designers in the last couple of weeks of encouraging them to raise their expectations a little bit. Hey, the numbers you're quoting are a little bit low. I mean, I don't have like the data in front of me, but I feel like I have that conversation more with quite experienced female designers at kind of like a lead or should be maybe a staff. And I find that sometimes they're underquoting their number versus maybe one of their male counterparts.
Interesting.
And I try to guide them and say, look, I know you maybe have flexibility, and I know that you would be happy with the salary at this number that you're quoting to me. But just so you know, like, I think that some other male counterparts or other people with your type of experience, they're talking numbers like this, and companies are paying numbers like that for your kind of experience. So if someone asks you again, feel a little more comfortable maybe and confident to start a bit higher. Quote your range a little bit higher. Come up a notch. Worst case, if you got to come back down to, because that's their budget, then you have that flexibility. But when you quote too low from the start, it's pretty hard to raise it after that. So I've had that conversation with a handful of people too, and encourage them to really push it up a little bit more. I think they're undervaluing themselves quite a bit.
Yeah. I see that.
Everyone should know kind of what like their floor number is, like, and keep that to yourself, like close to the chest. And then always pitch higher, because, and I deal with this with everyone with their, when they're giving ranges to recruiters, not through me even, just kind of giving really long ranges. I always say the recruiter, their job is to save their company money. They're only going to hear the bottom number.
Yeah.
So unless it's a great company and they're like, yes, we value you and we're going to pay you like at the top end because we want you. That is like way like 1 in 10, I think. I don't think that happens often. We all wish it happened more. So always pitch higher and always do like a 5K increment. Or what I like to tell people is say, I'm interviewing at the 175K range. My other interviews are paying 175K. And that's where, or like, I was at 180K in my last role and I need to stay close to that. And just give one number and that's it. And then they can kind of sort of say, hey, are you a little flexible? Or, that's a little higher. Hopefully if it's in New York City or California, they've shared the salary range. But as we also know, they can be ranges from 80 to 300. So that's really unhelpful.
Super helpful. I know. So ridiculous.
So dumb. I find myself explaining to people why companies do that. It's just really, they're open to the profile, but in a sense, if you read it, you see it's like the longest thing ever. It has everything written in there.
Yeah.
And I think that they really probably are leaning towards somebody more senior, especially if they have a 300K on the other end of that bookend.
Yeah.
Um,
You know, I read this great book called Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. I think we talked about it before on here once before, but he gives some great negotiation strategies around salary. So I definitely recommend the book to check out. And one of the exercises that he was quoting was, and Erica, to your point, like when you're saying like start higher, it's like you're now, like when you say the higher number, you're creating a world in which now you're playing, right? Like with the offer. If you start lower, now we're working in this world. Like you can only really kind of go up or down a little bit, like within that range. But if you start higher, knowing that maybe you have some flexibility to go down, you're starting in a range where you want to be. And so the exercise was that they had like an experimenter say, do you think that the population of Turkey is under or over 300 million people? And if not, like, what is it? But just by saying 300 million, and I think that the actual number was like something very different than 300 million. I don't remember the actual numbers, but then people would start guessing around 300 million because they had put that number out there. So now all of a sudden there's this reality that has been created by throwing out a number. So it's important that when you throw out that number, that it's in the world that you want to be in.
It's also good. Oh, sorry. It's just like a psychological thing too, you know, like I think you can pump yourself up too if you go a little higher. It's like you said before, it's really hard to kind of like dig out from if you're like a little bit like too low, honestly, in your pitch. And especially if you get to that final step and then they're like, okay, here's the offer. And then you're like, hey, actually, you know, I want 20K more or something. So just a little bit easier to start up there. And I feel like then you sort of build that confidence constantly talking about like, oh, I'm interviewing at this range. Like I'm interviewing with other companies for these types of roles that are paying this much money. How exciting, right? And like, it's a psychological impact, I think.
Right. And you don't have to share how much you're making now. Like actually we as recruiters, like no recruiters legally allowed to ask you that. You know, for pay discrepancy and inequities like through the years, like now they're making up for that, which is a wonderful thing. But I will say from personal experience, I always really like it when candidates offer up how much. I mean, you don't have to, but I find it helpful sometimes if they're like, well, I was making, 200 before. I know that this role is capping at 180. I'm open to going for it. There might be other things involved in it, right? It's not all monetary. Like maybe they have a really flexible work schedule, or maybe it's full remote and they live someplace that's not in a major tech hub, or it could be like all manner of things. But yeah, sorry, I lost my train of thought, but that was it.
It's all helpful. It's all helpful. I mean, look, I'll be honest, there's been a couple of people I walked away from in the last couple of weeks that quoted me a number and I went, no worries. I really hope you get that number. I don't know how it's ever going to happen, or I'm certainly not going to be the one to get you that number. I don't know a company that will see the alignment between that number and your experience and the value that number needs to come with. I'm not seeing it. If that's your number, then I implore you to go out there and do your absolute best. So yeah, I think for me as a recruiter these days, it's like, you can tell me numbers all day long, but I'll look and I'll decide where I think it lands to, because I've got way more data points to pull from and way more insight into where these things actually sit and fit. And I'll always be honest with people. It's easy. My last company, I was on this. That's awesome. You probably should have stayed because that's an amazing number. Or, wow, okay, well, that's not as good a number as what you should get. There is an opportunity for you to really get the value that you can bring. That last company, maybe they undervalued you a little bit. Let's get that more aligned with the market. So,
I think it's important to have a consultative relationship with your recruiters if you are working with one, like an outside recruiter like us.
It can help.
Because you can be more honest with us